Hey Mustangs, in this video we're going to be taking a look at phylogeny and cladograms. Now when we talk about phylogeny and cladograms, we're taking a look at the evolutionary history of organisms, and we're seeing how they have changed over time and how organisms are related to each other. And that's a big thing right there. How are organisms related to each other? And that's what cladograms focus on, the relatedness of each species. Now, in class, we talked about the hypothesis that all life on our planet started from a single-celled prokaryote ancestor and has branched off and through speciation events since then. So we can say from that yeah, all life on our planet is related in some way if we trace it all the way back to that ancestor 3.5 billion years ago. But some species are more recently related to each other. And so when we take a look at cladograms, we want to find out how species are related to each other. How exactly can we break down the tree of life, really? So let's go ahead and take a look. All right. First thing is phylogeny. So phylogeny is the evolutionary history of a group or species. So we're looking at how a species or group has changed over time. That's what we talk about when we're talking about phylogeny. That's what we look at when we're talking about phylogeny. How has a group or species changed over time? In what ways has it changed? Now, in order to really understand phylogeny, you have to understand speciation. So I have a couple examples here of speciation. So what we learned is that speciation occurs when isolation happens, and what I like to call the big three, when you have evolution from natural selection, mutations, and genetic drift happening once a species becomes isolated. That leads to changes in the two isolated groups, and they start to become different over time until they become two different species. So here, if we take a look, here's a common ancestor, and that common ancestor is going to branch into two different species here. So they become isolated at this point. So here's the last point you see the common ancestor at. And that common ancestor becomes isolated into two different groups, and this group changes and becomes one species over time. This group changes and becomes a different species over time. Another way we can look at it is something like this happening. Again, though, you see branching occurring due to isolation. So this one species branches into new species. So here in this case, you have the original species that actually continues on, but from that original species, there's an isolation event that causes a branching and a group from that species to become isolated and change and become different over time. Over here, same thing, you have a branching. A group of that species becomes isolated and starts to change and become different over time. And again, don't forget it's the big three. It's your natural selection, mutations, genetic drift happening that causes these changes over time. So when you're talking about phylogeny and how a group has changed over time, you really kind of got to think about speciation events, how a species has branched and changed and become different species over time. All right. So in order to understand the phylogeny of a group and really visualize what's happening, how a species or group has changed over time, a cladogram can be used. Okay, so with a cladogram, you're able to predict the relatedness and ancestry within a group. So what you do is with a cladogram, you start. Let me get this here. You start with an ancestral species, and that ancestral species is going to hit a point where isolation occurs and it branches into two different species. You get a branching event here. So a speciation event or a branching event. Right here, this is where the common ancestor ends. This was their common ancestor. This original species branched into two different species. Well, and we're going to continue along this way. So this species continues to change over time, and eventually they branch. So they go through a speciation event, and they branch into two different species. Again, this was their last common ancestor right here before it branched. So they branch into two different species here. Continue on, same thing. So you can imagine you have a branching event and a speciation event happens there. And this was the common ancestor right here, but then they branched into two different species here. Now this is really simplified. You can continue off of this. So you could say like right here, yeah, this species branched, but then it branched, it had a speciation event and branched into different species, and so on and so on. So you can have more branches. But the most simplified is where you have species, speciation event causes branching, species, speciation event causes branching. So that's the most simple you can get when you're talking about a cladogram, looking at it like that. All right, now there's two different ways that you can actually create a cladogram, two main ways really that you can create a cladogram. One is based on morphology, which is looking at the physical features of organisms and comparing them together. And one thing that we know is that organisms who are more closely related are going to have more similarities in their body plans. And that makes sense because if they share a recent common ancestor and that common ancestor went through a speciation event, they're going to still be similar to each other because they shared a recent common ancestor. So their body plans haven't had a long enough time to actually change over time. Now, creating a cladogram based on morphology is really the old way of creating a cladogram. This is basically before DNA, and this is how scientists used to create cladograms, and they still do. They still do use morphology, but DNA is really the way to go nowadays. So, in order to take a look at how species are related to each other, you look at the similarities in their body plans. And when you're talking about similarities in their body plans, you really want to focus on homologous structures. The organisms that are more closely related will have more similarities in their body plans, and that's because of homologous structures. We know that with homologous structures, these are parts of the body that are similar in two related species because their common ancestor had that body structure. So that their common ancestor had that body structure. So when they branched off, the two new species also had that body structure because their ancestor had it. So we can look at homologous structures to help us identify ancestry and relatedness. Now, the reason why using morphology to create a cladogram is kind of like the old way of doing it is because of analogous structures. Now, analogous structures, remember, are structures that appear to be similar to each other, and it may insinuate that two species are actually closely related and shared a common ancestor, when in fact they don't. If you look more closely, you see that usually it's on the outside that they share similarities, and the reason why they share similarities on the outside is because they have evolved in similar environments, and those similar environments put pressure on them to evolve certain exterior physical features. And so two organisms may look similar, but those similarities aren't because they share a common ancestor. It's because evolutionary pressures, natural selection pressures, have caused them to evolve those similar structures because of their environments. All right, so the way you create a cladogram with morphological features is you start with a common ancestor. So down here is a common ancestor, and the one thing that all the organisms past this point are going to have in common is a vertebrae. So the oldest common ancestor had a vertebrae, so in this case a backbone. And every organism past that point is going to have that backbone because it's a homologous structure. It's something that you would expect everything past that point to have. Okay, so we're going to say that everything past that point is going to have a vertebrae, and we're going to say, okay, here's the ancestral species. It's going, it branches. You could say a speciation event happens here, branches into two different groups. One group leads to the evolution of sharks, the other continues on. As the other group continues on and continues to evolve, at some point they evolve a bony skeleton. Now, because they have that bony skeleton, at this point on, everything past that you would assume is also going to have a bony skeleton because everything's going to evolve from this ancestor and it's going to have a bony skeleton. So here, this ancestor with a vertebrae and a bony skeleton continues on, and then a speciation event happens here, branches into two different species. One species leads to ray-finned fish, the other species continues on. At some point while this other species continues on, they evolve another characteristics, in this case 4 limbs. And again, you can assume every organism past this point is going to have a vertebrae, bony skeleton, and now 4 limbs. So anything that evolves past this point will have 4 limbs because the common ancestor has 4 limbs. So we continue on, speciation event, branches, one evolves into amphibians, the other continues on. At some point, they evolve the amniotic egg. The amniotic egg, any organism past that point will have the amniotic egg. So here we have a branching event, made a little bit more complicated here, but not much. So in this branching event for speciation, one branches off this way and evolves into primates and rabbits. Here, this is the most recent common ancestor for the primates and rabbits. So this branched off. Hair evolved at some point in an ancestor, but then the ancestor branched into two groups here. So rabbits and rodents and then primates here. So this is their common ancestor right there. That's the branching point where their common ancestor existed. This continues on this way. At some point, eggs with shells evolve, and as a result of that, you have birds, and here's a branching point here. So here's a speciation event here, a branching point that evolves into crocodiles and birds. So whenever you're looking at morphological features, you look first at the oldest common ancestor, and whatever they had, every organism past that's going to have. So all of these have vertebrae. Evolution occurs here. Everything past that will have bony skeleton, and so on and so on. So that's how you use morphology in order to create a cladogram.